Mr. President, Lyndon Johnson has always been a personal hero to me. Every time I find myself in Austin, Texas, I make a visit to the LBJ Library. Only for me, it's not a trip, it's more of a pilgrimage. I've been to that library so many times, I think I could conduct a blindfolded tour by now. I was just there a couple of months ago. And my favorite place in that library, of course, is the Great Society room, with the plaques on the wall listing the incredible array of legislation and programs that Lyndon Johnson passed into law. And you go down it, and you read them all. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Job Corps, VISTA, Upward Bound, the Food Stamp Program, Legal Services, the Community Action Program, Community Health Centers, Head Start, Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Higher Education Act, Medicare, Medicaid, the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities, Public Broadcasting, Mass Transportation Act, the Cigarette Labeling Act, the Clean Air Act, the Wilderness Act. Mr. President, it takes your breath away when you look at what this one person with a Congress was able to accomplish. So, Mr. President, I come to the floor today to talk about the, quote, failure of the Great Society. And every time I use the word failure, I want to put in quotes. Yes, the, quote, failure of the Great Society. You know, at least that's what I've been hearing, Mr. President, ever since I first started running for office in 1972 and 74 and coming to the House and then to the Senate. All these years, I have heard from most of my friends on the other side of the aisle and the conservatives what a great failure the Great Society was. In fact, this supposed failure has become an article of faith among conservatives. As President Reagan said on May 9th, 1983, quote, "The great expansion of government programs that took place under the aegis of the Great Society coincided with an end to economic progress for America's poor people," end quote. So, I thought I'd come to the floor today to discuss the, quote, failures of the Great Society. Well, I wonder where to start, but I suppose a good place to start is with the Great Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now think about it. Prior to that act, African Americans faced brazen discrimination and segregation, the American version of apartheid. In many parts of our country, African Americans could not eat in the same restaurants or lunch counters as whites. They couldn't use the same bathrooms, the same swimming pools, the same water fountains, the same motels, the same hotels. They literally were consigned, as we know, to the back of the bus. Well, because of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Lyndon Johnson's championship of it, those Jim Crow laws and practices were ended in the United States of America. It became illegal to discriminate based on race, color, religion, gender, or national origin. And now we take it for granted. The people of color, different nationalities, different religions, are seen in our parks and playgrounds, our libraries, our swimming pools, our sports arenas, our motels and hotels. But it was not so long ago that this wasn't so. Hardly a, quote, failure. Another, quote, failure of the Great Society, of course, the Medicare program. Let's take a look at that. At the bill signing ceremony on July the 30th, 1965, President Johnson enrolled former President Harry Truman as the first Medicare beneficiary, presented him with his first Medicare card. We know we always talk about life after age 65 as the golden years. Well, Mr. President, for many, prior to Medicare, life after 65 used to be the nightmare years. Tens of millions of Americans unable to afford even basic medical care, condemned to living out their senior years in the misery of untreated or poorly treated illnesses and diseases. And here, Mr. President, I want to get personal. See, my father, Patrick Harkin, was 54 years old when I was born. My father had an 8th grade education. He had a hard life. Most of it spent as a coal miner. Now, most people don't think that there are coal mines outside of Pennsylvania or West Virginia. But in Iowa at one time was the 2nd largest coal producing state in the nation. And so for young kids who didn't go to school, they went to the coal mines. So my father worked for the greater part, more than 20 years in the coal mines. And later on in life, he suffered what they called then the miner's cough, which we now know as black lung disease. So my mother died when I was 10. So my father was just now about 65, and he had paid enough in the 40s, he paid enough in to qualify for Social Security. So he had Social Security. And he had 3 kids under the age of 18. And no money. We lived in this little 2-bedroom house out in the middle of a small town in Iowa. But we had Social Security that kept us together. But I can remember it was like clockwork. Every year, every winter, my father would get sick. He had this miner's cough. And usually in the winter, it would get worse, and he would come down with pneumonia or something like that. And since we didn't have a car, one of my cousins or someone, and my father he did not want to go to the hospital because we didn't have any money. And he wouldn't see a doctor because we didn't have money. So one of my cousins or somebody would come over, and finally he'd get so sick he couldn't stand it, and they'd rush him into Mercy Hospital in Des Moines. Thank God for the Sisters of Mercy and Mercy Hospital. They'd nurse him back to health, get him okay, send him back home. This happened like clockwork every winter. And my father was always bothered by it. Proud man. Didn't like to accept charity. Heck, if left to his own devices, he probably would have died a long time before that, because he just wouldn't have accepted that kind of medical care. I can remember coming home on leave from the Navy for Christmas 1965. Now, I hadn't been paying too much attention. I was just trying to keep alive. So I wasn't paying too much attention to legislation and things like that. I didn't mark the passage of the Medicare bill, didn't know it even happened. I said I was just in the military doing my thing. But I can remember coming home on that Christmas break and seeing my dad, and he showed me his Medicare card. And now he could get medical care, he could go to the doctor. If he had to go to the hospital, he could go and get taken care of before he got so sick he had to go to the hospital every time. You can't imagine what this was like for him. See, he felt that he had earned this through a lifetime of hard work, working for our country, raising a family. This was not charity. He had earned this. It was part of his Social Security. So when someone tells me about Medicare, part of the failures of the Great Society, hardly a failure. I wonder why there aren't more people out here rushing to introduce bills to repeal it if it's such a great failure. It has saved so many people in our country, like my father, who lived out the remainder of his years in a little bit better health because of Medicare.